Hi folks, my name's Chris Brown and I'm co-curator of Hello Culture and editor of Polaroids and Polar Bears. First up, thank you all for joining us today as part of today's panel on queer culture as part of the Hello Culture programme. So we're really excited to have you on board today. Today we're going to be exploring how queer communities have created online spaces to express their cultural lives. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up today who I will do introductions to in a minute. But I guess first off, to do some of the technical information, today's session is closed captions and they are available at the bottom of the screen. There is an option there for you to view the full transcript as well as displaying the scrolling subtitles, and we'll be recording the session so you'll be able to watch it again on the Hello Culture website afterwards as well. As I said, today we'll be hearing from our expert panel. That will last for around 20 minutes. Then we'll move into questions from all of you guys. So if you've got any questions, please do send them in and they'll be fed through from the technical team to myself, and we'll answer what we can before our time runs out today. So today's session, what's it all about? Now, I'm not sure about you, but I'm well and truly over lockdown. To begin with, I have to admit it kind of seemed fun. The potential to explore new hobbies, not to use public transport or go to work, to get to work, and of course, binge every episode of Pose for the third time running. I've been fortunate enough to have a safe space to weather out lockdown with my partner and our two foster children at home. Now, unfortunately, many are not as fortunate as I am. LGBTQ plus communities in particular have been hit hard as many of their safe spaces have been closed. Now, when we talk about queer spaces, we're not just talking about bars and clubs, which do play a big part. It is anywhere where there is a convergence of queerness, and this could be a museum, an art gallery, a coffee shop, a bookshop, community hall, or anything else for that matter. Without these spaces, many young people, young queer people, have struggled to make the connections in order to explore their sexual identity and gender identity in a physical setting. So they've turned to digital in order to learn, participate, engage, communicate, and construct their identities. Now, there are plenty of platforms out there where these identities have been explored. I, in particular, have been looking at TikTok recently. I've moved away from it. I didn't explore it to begin with, but I've now fallen down that rabbit hole with queer content creators. But today's panel are going to explore some other spaces as well, spaces that they too have created or have created in conjunction with other people as well, spaces that have evolved from lockdown. And what we're going to be looking at is these spaces, how they've been created, but also what happens next. When we eventually come out of lockdown and we return back to our normal lives, whatever that new normal is, I hate that phrase, but you know what I mean, we'll be seeing as what happens to these spaces. Will they continue to operate, or will they evolve once again to sort of mix the physical spaces with the digital spaces? So, who have we got on the panel today? Well, we have two fantastic panelists on board today. We have Dan Vo, the freelance museum consultant, and Sacha Coward as well, who is a partner of crime. Both of those two will do their introductions in a moment. Unfortunately, we were meant to have another panelist, Kate O'Donnell, who is artistic director of Trans Creative. Unfortunately, Kate can't join us today. She's in Turkey at the moment, weathering out lockdown, and they've had a power cut in the village where she's based. And when I mean power cut, I mean complete power cut. There is no power for her laptop or her Wi-Fi. So unfortunately, she's not able to join us today. However, we're looking at ways that we can explore Kate's work. So keep your eyes peeled after today's session. So we may do a follow-up event just dedicated to Kate because she has got some fantastic stories to tell. And I think it's really important that we get those stories and her own ideas as well across. So before I hand over to Sacha, before he does his intro about who he is, we're going to play a short clip that introduces Dan and Sacha and some of the work they've been doing. So let's play the clip.
This Thursday on BBC Arts, you'll see me. And me. Because as part of Culture in Quarantine, we'll be bringing you Museum from Home.
There'll be exclusive insights into how museums in lockdown are looking after the nation's treasures.
If you work for a gallery, library, archive or museum, a GLAM, then you can share your content with the hashtag Museum from Home on Thursday, April 30.
The BBC is looking to share as much of your lovely content as it can.
And if you're watching from lockdown, then stay posted to find out how you can be involved.
Bye!
Bye!
I love that picture at the end as well. So you have Dan and Sacha there. So I'm going to introduce Sacha now, and hopefully he'll turn his camera on and everything, and he's going to tell us about himself and his work. You'll also notice we had a little bit of discussion before we started today's event. We all apparently need to bring props with us. So as Lara has tweeted, I have got my Shout t-shirt on, so big fan of the Shout Festival in Birmingham, which is a queer arts festival, and if you caught our keynote before that, Le Gâteau Chocolat, that session will be uploaded as well afterwards. He was one of the events at the last Shout Festival. But Sacha, as you can see, has dressed up for the occasion as well. So Sacha, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I feel firstly I just have to briefly explain that there's a trident and there's blue hair going on and there's a merman, a lumberjack merman no less, on my t-shirt. I will explain what that's about. If you have no idea why this is happening, it will make sense at some point. My name is Sacha. I am a museum freelancer. I specialize in doing queer history tours, events. I also build escape rooms. So I've pretty much got one of the most hipster job titles you can imagine. Queer folklore historian, tour guide, escape room designer, what have you. I'm really pleased to be on here, so thank you so much for having me here. And it's kind of beautiful but also tragic seeing that photo, that image of me and Dan. That was a few years ago outside the Science Museum, and obviously we can't do that anymore. We can't cuddle, we can't get together as a community. So kind of what I've been doing is trying to work out the stuff that I do. How do I do this in a world that is on fire? How do I do this in a world that is completely different? So I've got a few pictures that I can put up in the background to show some of the kinds of work that I've been involved with in the past. So we can pop the slide up. So that's kind of the tours, the work with queer youth, examples of communities that I would be working with. So there's a group in the bottom left, which is a queer youth group I built an escape room with. There's me and Sheldon doing a queer cemetery tour. That's what I do. So trying to take this online has created all kinds of weird stuff that we'll really get into. And one of those was Museum from Home. Now, I know that video that played at the start was very quiet, but it was a big boon for me and Dan, a project called Museum from Home, which started at the very beginning of lockdown as a WhatsApp conversation between the two of us going, we're freelancers, but we can't go into museums anymore. What do we do? So we took to Twitter and I made a bunch of 60-second videos, one of which I'll show you in a moment. And Dan did some kind of live interviews with people from the museum sector. And it's built and became an international movement. And that video that was playing at the start, it was taken on by the BBC. And we've now had 2 full days of broadcasting live of BBC content about museums. But because me and Dan sort of were 2 of the people who were instigators on this, we've got a beating queer heart. So it also became a great way to platform queerness. And hopefully we'll get to chat a little bit more about that. Now, if you've never come across Museum from Home, an example of what I did is I produced a 60-second video every single day for at least 70 days of the first lockdown, about 15 days of the second lockdown. And I've got one that I'll just show you as an example, me talking very, very fast about queer history.
Happy Easter, Isolationists! So today I want to tell you the queer backstory to The Little Mermaid. So, Hans Christiansen, who wrote The Little Mermaid, was biromantic. He used to write love letters to men and to women. He'd just been writing these really emotional letters to a guy called Edvard Collin, but Edvard did not reciprocate. Basically said, I don't feel the way that you do. Sorry, dude. Now, Hans was devastated, so he ran off and wrote The Little Mermaid. Now, the original version of The Little Mermaid is really, really sad. So she has a tongue cut out. She's got cursed feet that feel like she's walking on broken glass, and at the end she does not get the prince. No, she gets turned into sea foam. Now this story was adapted by Disney. Now a lot of people feel it's been Disneyfied. Why have they given Ariel this happy ending? Well, let's remember that this was also worked on by Howard Ashman. Howard Ashman was a gay man living during the 80s who worked on the Disney film, wrote a lot of the songs like Part of Your World, and died of HIV a year later. So maybe it's okay that this poor mermaid, created by two queer men, actually gets a happy ending in the end.
So now maybe you get the weird merman Aquaman thing going on. So the mermaid reference is a kind of an old thing that I love using mermaids and folklore and fairy tales as a way to talk about queerness. So even though that was quiet, hopefully you got to read some of the subtitles. It's the queer backstory to Little Mermaid, which is fascinating. But having to encapsulate that into 60 seconds is definitely a challenge. But it was a really cool thing to do. It kept me working and it allowed me to engage with millions of people around the world. And it wasn't just me and Dan, far from it. This became like a movement. So Museum from Home was trending. It stopped being our baby. And that's exactly what we wanted it to be. It became people from their homes, from their kitchens, from their living rooms, their bedrooms, telling stories about history and folklore. And many of those people were queer. And it was this really cool democratizing space. So not just curators, people who are accredited to work in museums, but anyone having the opportunity to tell their story. And that was one of the beautiful things, that even though lockdown was so dark, it was a really powerful thing that came out of that time. And I've also had the opportunity to work, virtually with people all over the world, all over the country, including a queer youth group in Cardiff, a queer youth group in Hastings. And that is something that you often can't do unless you use technology. So there's going to be a lot of dark talk, and I hope you can take some of the stuff I'm saying seriously, even though I've got blue hair and a trident. There is some dark stuff here because, as Chris said at the outset, queer people are right at the knife point of when society closes down. We are set up to lose so much. And yet there are these opportunities that technology can afford us. There are pitfalls, but there are also positives. So I hope both me and Dan will get the opportunity to share as much of that with you today.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Sacha. I'm a massive fan of Museums from Home. Fortunate enough to, when we were in lockdown, I worked and lived in Birmingham for 10 years, and we had the fantastic Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery open and on our doorstep. But you know what? Walking around a museum, it's great. You can see things and you can read things and stuff like that. But I'm one of those learners that kind of have to be told stuff. I struggle taking in information, just reading it from off a script or something like that. And I have to say, I learned so much from Museums from Home, really random stuff like from yourselves, but there's also been a couple of other museum curators that we've actually had as panelists for Hello Culture over the years. And the stuff that I've learned has just been insane. So why do you think it's been important to still be able to access museums online, particularly from a queer culture perspective? Why do you think that?
I'll put my trident down. I hope that's okay. I've got to gesticulate now. So one of the things is that, for queer people, family is not necessarily the people that you're in the house with. Family is this really loose, complex term. And sometimes family is hostile or distant or cold. If you're lucky, it's not, but your family tends to be much more broad. And it tends to go forward in time and backwards in time. So you have this connection with a queer past that, in a world which tragically still today doesn't fully accept queer people, it grounds you and it roots you. So when you're pulled away from that, it's not just a case of, oh, I don't get to go to my favorite museum and have a nice latte and look at some pretty art, which in itself is painful, it's a loss. It is also, I am no longer connected with that thing that grounds me as a valid human being, that tells me that people like me have always existed, that people that have loved like me, who've identified like me, are legitimate. So being able to flood the internet with these 60 seconds, very rough and ready clips, many of which are talking about identity, and then seeing young people, and we have teenagers, people in Australia, a group of homeschooled kids in Texas, using this content, either watch it or produce their own stuff. And it becomes this buzzing of a million voices, not just you. And I can just feel from many of the messages I received, particularly from queer people, would log in every day, maybe just for 10 minutes with a cup of tea, just to go through the hashtag and just watch a few videos and just have that moment of connection when we were all feeling so disconnected, to be able to go, the museums are closed, but they haven't gone. The history is not as accessible, but it hasn't gone. And our past, the thing that roots us, is not dead. It's still there, and there's still people talking about it. That's why I think it's so important.
Brilliant. It's all very emotional, isn't it? It's like it's those safe spaces, and for people to the community, and how it's shifted from physical to digital. It's been a journey, but I think the next 12 to 24 months are going to be really interesting to see how that evolves once again, and the mixture between the physical and the digital spaces as well, and how that's going to move forward. So thank you very much. So we're going to move on to our next panelist now. So Dan is going to come join us in a second, and then we'll be back for questions at the end. Just a quick reminder, if you have got any questions that you'd like to ask the panel themselves, please do pop them in the chat, and we will answer them if we can after Dan's bit. So Dan, if you'd like to come join us on this digital panel. Sacha showed us his props. What props have you got today? You can kind of see yours, but
it's a bit tough to follow a merman, isn't it? I think is the difficulty of it all. But hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you. So I hope you can see what I've got behind me. So I too have dyed my hair blue, but I can't show you that. So instead, what I'm going to show you is one of my favorite things that happened in lockdown #1, which was carrying on from what Sacha was talking about, which is the museum from home. For me, it was about talking to an array of wonderful people. So museum from home became a bit of a chat that I would have at lunchtime. And for me, it was really a godsend, because I kind of was here on my own, and being able to tune in with somebody else, but also share the conversation that we were having, was really special. So I hope to be able to tell you a little bit about how those conversations expanded over time as well.
Marvelous. I love that picture so much, like following the museum from home journey, and then seeing it start off with just a couple of you, and how it's grown and grown and grown. And I mean, if there's not a more perfect picture of community than in that, I just don't, you know what I mean? I just don't think there is, really, just seeing all those faces there. So yeah. So yes, Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself, and what have you been up to in terms of lockdown then?
Thank you. So if we can just jump to slides, it'd be wonderful to sort of show you what I did and what I do now. But just talking about that idea of community, right there in the center there, we've got super gay Sacha Cowell. It was the first conversation, oh, actually the second conversation, because the first conversation was with Sheldon Goodman, but it was really a way of being able to take what I do regularly, which is audience engagement. So that is, as you can see in this wonderful slide here, a wonderful group of people coming to the V&A Museum, and instantly, overnight, as the doors closed, we weren't able to bring in people to celebrate queer history in our museum anymore. We had moments in time where we had 100 people in the medieval Renaissance gallery shouting the word queer together as a celebration, reclaiming the space, echoing the word queer, shaking the foundation of the museum. And yet suddenly, with the doors closed, it was a very difficult thing to do. We could no longer do it in person, so we had to switch to online. And so thankfully, with the idea that Sacha sort of came up with Museum from Home, I started doing a few 1-minuters, but then it's sort of expanded into a 15-minute chat with people. As you can see, there's a wonderful board of people that we had a chat with, and it was just really exploring what different people thought about what it was to engage with queer history, but not just queer history. As we moved through different moments in time throughout lockdown, you also had the Black Lives Matter protests. You had the pulling down of the Colston statue. There was really important cultural moments which were brought into the conversation that I was having with everybody as well. And so it was really great to show that community. One of the highlights I had was talking with Mark Gatiss as part of Museum from Home and QB Lockdown Hunt as well, which was something I was doing with the Queer Britain Museum. But really, we also took the opportunity to show people the different ways in which we engage with the collection and bring it into relevance for people. And so taking the LGBTQ tour in the V&A, and it was done in my bedroom, and you can see my handmade bunting that says LGBTQ tour, and then tuning in with each of the volunteers to show some of the rich collections that we've got was really strong and powerful and important for me. And another thing that was really important was when we had that moment in time when museums started to reopen, it was to make sure that people were still able to access the collection as well. And so we did create an online trail. And for me, it was remarkable to be able to include an object that I've long wanted to include on the LGBTQ plus trail, and finally working with the interpretation team to look at Avalokiteshvara Guanyin, this beautiful bronze statue that I'm gesturing at, because it sort of helps do what Sacha was talking about, which is tell us about the richness of our history, but how we exist across place, time, and culture. And here is a deity from the Buddhist faith that sort of starts off in India, takes a 1,000-year journey throughout Asia, and changes gender as well, transcends gender as well. And so that's really interesting. But it's always, for me, coming back to the root of it. It's about taking the story and working with people to help them tell their own story in their own words, and being able to look at how we can use the past in order to change the present day and inform our future as well. So in the next slide, you're actually going to hear what came next, which was a set of podcasts that was launched. So hopefully we can play this one with Amir Ashur from Iroquois talking about why we do this.
I hope one day Iraqi will not have to exist anymore, because we exist to address certain needs and address certain violations. And this is not something we want to have to do for the next, in the future. So my hope for Iraq is to be a country where people, regardless of their identities, are recognized, they are protected under the law, and are able to perform their responsibility of rebuilding the country. Whether people includes LGBT plus people or women, people with disabilities, people from all kinds of different gender identities. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you have your rights, you enjoy your rights, you are performing your responsibilities. And as long as you're not hurting anyone else, you should be allowed to exist safely and freely.
The purpose of Sound Out was to look at voices of LGBTQ activism around the world. And it was to hear from the people around the world in their own voice what it was like to be queer where they are, what it was like to be in lockdown and queer where they are. And so Amir Ashur, for example, was talking about how it was really important that in order to combat the past, the colonial contact where British laws were introduced around the world and criminalized homosexuality all across the world, and there's a legacy that remains in Iraq to this day, is how we can work on addressing that. But also during lockdown, it was really much about how it was doing it by doing really basic things like feeding people, by getting medicines to people, things that suddenly LGBTQ plus people were not having access to. And it was a story that came out and was evident across the world. So in the next slide, I'm going to actually drop you into another show that I started up as well called The Past is Queer. And we're just going to listen to the very first interview up to the first beats, Gareth. And there's a trigger warning on this one, but I'll explain why I've picked this particular clip. So if we play that, please.
First song choice by our guest for today, EJ Scott. You're on Alphabet Radio, and this is The Past is Queer. EJ.
Hello.
Did it drop you right back into Toowoomba in Australia, reminding you of young EJ?
I was so young then, and it was such a scary place for me. And I mean, there's one of the most horrific stories about the little town that I grew up in. There was a tree in the town that the queer kids used to take their life on. It was like this one tree that was so, trigger warning, apologies, but it was just like, it was so horrifically homophobic that you couldn't even imagine being trans. Do you know what I mean? Like, you couldn't, like, it just was, the thought of being able to transition was completely and utterly impossible and dangerous. When I came out, I didn't know a single other trans person.
Thank you, Gareth. So last slide is going to show you just some of the stories that were picked up throughout that. So it was EJ sort of dropped us into a very thoughtful, something to give us a lot of thought and consideration to. It was a remarkable interview, and I'm so grateful to EJ for having been so open. EJ being the founder of the Museum of Transology. And throughout lockdown as well, EJ, and throughout that interview, EJ sort of talks about how the Museum of Transology is now seeking to increase the stories of people from around the world as well, and looking for stories of people of color and the stories of Black people as well who are trans. And I think that's really important to sort of see how things shifted quite dramatically. It's something, I mean, the Museum of Transology has always been very open and inclusive, but to sort of see that happen across the sector as well, I think is really strong and interesting. And yet to see those other museums, certain museums that might be lagging a little bit as well. But for me, it is always about the stories. And what EJ did that was really strong for me in that interview was talk about how EJ is inspired by other trans people. So Kate would have been on the show. One of the things that EJ talked about was the what we called trans karaoke. So EJ sort of picked a bunch of songs to play out. It was like Desert Island Discs, but replaced the word words in the song with the word trans. And so one of the songs that we did was Stand By Your Trans, which is part of Kate O'Donnell's wonderful trans creative festival that was held. So I'm very proud to have had that sung by EJ and also to be able to wear Kate's wonderful work as well. But for me, it is all about looking at how we are able to provide a platform to people to be able to share their story in their own voices. And so I'm now going to take you to a last wonderful video, a little trailer that talks about the Queer Heritage Collections Network, which is right down there on the bottom. And it's very much about how the sector is trying to work with each other in order to amplify queer stories in our collections. And so if you're working in media, for example, and you want to produce these stories with us, please do. But this is a great example of how by giving agency to young people, by giving agency to queer people, we can actually make our places, our historical places alive.
We are making a new piece of theatre that celebrates and uncovers the hidden queer history that is located at Eltham Palace.
I want to create a piece of theatre which makes the people that feel like English heritage sites aren't for them, it's actually their right to be there, because these sites, they are designed for us and by us.
It's owning the queer stories that came with this site, the unspoken story. Queerness is a celebration.
We have to create those conversations. These real life people were never heard, and it feels like it's our responsibility to finally give them a voice and to empower ourselves to have our own voices.
Well, that's it from me. That's English Heritage, as you can see, did a wonderful project. Therefore, they shout out that project.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think it's quite emotional, actually. I mean, that last video in particular, and the podcasts you've done. I mean, I know we were on about trigger warnings and things like that, but you know, it's incredibly powerful stuff, and I really recommend that people check out the links that have been posted in the chat, because a lot of these stories just wouldn't have been able to have been told. So first off, I kind of want to say thank you to people like Dan and for Sacha for actually telling these stories. Now, I realize they are other people's stories as well, but I think actually both these people and the people that work with it and anybody else that does it just kind of just deserves like a massive clap, scream, shout, whistle, whatever you want, because it's just so important that these stories get told, particularly in a time where a lot of people do feel alone. They may feel trapped in their bedrooms or in their homes, not in safe spaces at all. So I think having access to this sort of thing, I think, is so important. So yeah, thank you both, and to everyone else that sort of does this sort of work. So yeah, I've got a quick question for Dan first, and then we'll jump in with everyone, with Sacha as well. Do you think it's we've obviously talked about why it's so important. Do you think the lockdown has forced people to reevaluate how they tell these stories then? Because obviously we've had to go digital, so it has meant more podcasts, more videos and things like that. Do you think more stories have come out of lockdown because people have been forced to look at new ways? Do you think it's allowed you to tell more stories, I guess?
I mean, I think it was something that has been developing. You know, I've been working in media for 20-ish years. So it's something that has been increasing. I started in the community radio sector. So it's always about being about the community's voice, made for, by the community, etc. So I think it's just become the fact that we now have the technology so readily available. Not everybody, of course, but so there are still challenges to be overcome. I'm currently wearing the LGBT Plus History Month badge for 2021. The theme is Body, Mind and Spirit. That's coming up in just a few days. So have a think about what you'll be doing for LGBT Plus History Month for yourself. And I think that's the thing. We had to go digital. We worked with the British Library in order to bring the stories to people. And one of the ways that we overcame that hurdle was we worked with the Knowledge Network, which they've got, which took us around to a set of libraries around the country, about 30 libraries as well. So that was one of the ways that we tried to make sure that it was still accessible as well. So at the time, it was possible for people to actually go into the library and be able to watch it as well. So that was one of the ways that we sort of tried to overcome for those who may not have access to the technology. But I think that there are amazing organizations out there who are really doing great work as well. So I'm going to do a shout out to the Museum of Homelessness, which Sacha and I both had a chance to interview Jess Turtle as well. And I think that's a great example of how a museum is really at the forefront of shaping community and culture, but also really, getting out there on the streets and helping. And it was about, provision of food and medicines as well. But being able to get people to have access to technology is another really core aspect, and campaigning on their behalf. So I think there is opportunities there for those who work in media and museums to be able to help us all to take a step forward and be able to share our stories more easily.
At this point, we would have asked Kate to join us. As I said, she can't join us today, unfortunately, due to power cuts. But definitely worth checking out Trans Creative's work, as Dan mentioned as well, and we'll be sharing the links for that, and hopefully doing a follow-up session as well. We've talked with telling stories. Obviously, it's usually much easier when you're in a physical space and it's you physically telling someone face to face, and we've done a couple of sessions on podcasting and things like that in the past, and actually a lot of people have created their own podcasts. I know do a podcast about board games and stuff, and sometimes all you need is literally and again, this still isn't accessible, but sometimes you just need a computer and maybe even a phone and a headset or something like that, which is more accessible, but perhaps still not completely accessible. But in terms of what happens next? What happens when we come out of lockdown, and what happens to things like museum, home, and things like Cemetery Club as well, which I know that went digital and things like that as well. I still want Cemetery Club to come around the graveyard that's by my house, in all honesty. And every time I walk through the graveyard or I'm walking the dog, I'm kind of like, oh, I wonder if they'd come do it in Rugeley. Don't know who's here. But yeah, so after lockdown, what happens to these projects? Do we think they would continue? Or do you think they evolve? Sacha, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to this. There's a positive. So one of the positives is one of the things that's hold us back from telling these powerful, real stories. And queer stories are often very real, like they're everyday, they're prosaic, they're real people telling them. They're not glossy, big budget Hollywood things. Museums and cultural spaces in the past have often had this very strong, well, it's got to be filmed in this resolution and it's got to be like this and scripted, which means that a lot of queer history doesn't get spoken about because it's told over a camera phone on TikTok, not in a huge stage. So, just a little share, I have a sock on my microphone. Like, we've all given up any pretense that we are these Hollywood producers. And I hope that carries forward, that we remember that a story that is recorded on a very basic piece of equipment or scrawled down on a piece of paper is just as valid as the big glossy production. So museums, I'm hoping, on a positive note, will continue to collect stories because the stories are good, not because they look good or they're shiny. What happens next, and the thing that I'm concerned about, is obviously there are going to be cuts. We've already seen these cuts. We are seeing people losing their jobs. We are seeing museums closing, some of whom may not open again. And that is frightening to see for many reasons, because it's sad to lose heritage. But in terms of queer history, what tends to be cut first? Now, from 10 years in the museum sector, I don't want to be cynical, but working in culture and heritage, it's diversity. It's still seen as the nice garnish on top. If you can have it, we'll do an LGBT History Month or a Pride event or an intersectional Black History event. But if we need to get down to the day as usual, if we need to cut back and scale back because we don't have the money, we need to keep the lights on. You often hear that phrase. We'll need to keep, you know, the cabinets clean, and everything else will have to go to the wayside. So my fear is, and I hope I'm wrong, is that when there are cuts, the places we will feel those cuts first are things like queer history, intersectional history. And that also includes Black history, accessibility. All of those other phrases are the things I worry will drop by the wayside.
Dan, do you want to come on that as well?
Yeah, just to talk about that idea of what's coming next in terms of the future experience in museums. Working with Culture 24 at the moment, and they're a sector support organization, and it's looking at how we look at the future experience, because the idea of social distancing is going to last for a while. And so for museums, that means that puts the blockbuster exhibition at risk. And so how do you continue to ensure that you're engaging with your audience? So, well, for me, it is the idea of diversity, making sure that you kind of capture a wider audience rather than sort of a narrow but big audience, not articulating them very clearly, but what is going to happen is we are going to have to create or design or develop or think about what the future museum experience is going to be. And so it will be a hybrid experience where on one hand, you've got the things that you have in your collection, but on the other hand, it is going to be about how you get that out digitally. And I think a lot of collections have very rapidly stepped up to the plate. We've had it almost a year now, and they're doing really great things. And some of it is teams finally going, yes, we can just do it on a phone, because it's about the content being the most important thing. Content is queen, is the way to phrase it, I think. And it is to kind of just recognize that everyday stories are important. I think that's the other thing, there is so many collections wanting to collect, but the thing is, at the core of that, it means that everyday stories are important. So your story, Sacha's story, my story becomes really important. And that's the recognition that our queer perspective as queer people ourselves, our specific view is really important into the overall narrative. And I think that should be what we think about for the future, the hybrid museum experience, but also how do we ensure that we are including everybody's story as best as we can.
Like you said, I think for us, it's all about the stories, and stories can be told anywhere. And by that I mean, like if you're thinking about a traditional museum collection, what everyone thinks of in terms of portraits or statues or anything like that, that needs to be in a physical location, in theory, to see it in a museum. When Lara and I started Hello Culture 10 years ago, we were looking at museums were talking about using VR to explore the exhibitions and things, and that's come on a long way, but people are still often having those conversations about how to do that. But actually, you just don't. We want the museums to survive. We want those collections to happen, but actually get out there. Like the stories that you've been telling, Cemetery Club, as an example, is out and about in a cemetery. It's a tour of a physical space where, with social distancing, you'll be able to, hopefully keep that going once restrictions have lifted and things like that. And in the meantime, it's gone digital. So I think people need to be a bit more wary about the spaces as well. What's physical spaces are out there, both indoors and outdoors, and we're talking public squares and stuff like that where people can come together. I'm going to jump to some questions that we've had from our digital audience, and this one's coming from Jazz, and it's quite an important question, I think, particularly if you're anyone like me and you start doom scrolling on social media in an evening and things like that, because social media can be, we've talked about some fantastic positives here, but there are also some negatives to social media as well, because it is open. So Jazz's question is, can digital safe spaces pose any sort of risk to people exploring them? I know that social media filters content, so you can see sponsored content and you can mute certain things. But Jazz has heard of vulnerable young people being groomed into whatever, so terrorism, drugs, sex, etc., through the internet. He thinks it's an argument made by transphobic people and activists, and just wonders whether doing things online makes it easier for unsavoury people to do bad things. So I guess the point with this question is that when people are opening themselves up as queer communities and they're making themselves more visible, what's the danger that because they're now becoming more visible, they almost make targets themselves? So how do we protect these communities? Any thoughts? I guess, Dan, if we start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just give a few examples, and then I think maybe I might pass over to Sacha with an example that we both worked on, which is the Just Like Us, which has had excellent safeguarding practices in place. So do have a look at the Just Like Us team and the resources they've got, because in that case, it was working with primary school and secondary school students. But at the moment, I'm currently doing some work with Guernsey Park Museum, it's my local, and we're working with young people. And the practices that you have that exist in real life, should still be there. So we apply them. We have more than 2 people dialed in at any one time when there's a young person present. And also, it's the power of things like this. Having, say, a webinar, for example, when we did our symposium, we had, again, young people from English Heritage talking from the National Youth Theatre. By having the webinar system, it meant that there was a degree of moderation available. So the audience couldn't have direct access to them. It was via, it was like we have now. It kind of goes through to, it allows us to facilitate the questions and decide which ones should you put to them. It's not a perfect system, and it never will be. And us always trying to play for the idea that bad things will always happen. We've also got to look at the positive things that can come out of these sort of interactions as well, and the benefits of being able to do it that way. But yeah, I think always adhering to safeguarding practices and just informing yourself on what the best practice for that is. And at the moment, I'd say Just Like Us have got it really well. Would you agree, Sacha? I mean, the sessions that we did with them, would you like to have a think about that and comment?
Yeah, for those that don't know, Just Like Us is a charity which in the normal world would be sending individuals into schools as queer sort of icons or queer kind of people to talk about what it is to be queer in different fields and different expertise. And obviously they've now gone digital. So me and Dan did a bunch of talks with them, and they worked really hard on that. So I think, as Dan was saying, you've got to think really carefully. There is because we're used to leaving young people with tablets and YouTube sort of unguided, just kind of, and they're pretty savvy. Young people are pretty internet savvy. At the same time, an online digital space is nothing like a real world space, and anonymity sadly gives some people the ability to say some things they would never say in real life. And it also, if you go to a town hall in London, you don't have access to, transphobes in Texas. Whereas in Twitter, if someone from Russia or any part of the world wants to come into your conversation, there are ways to do it. So places like Just Like Us create safe spaces very carefully. They also prep their young people. I'm currently mentoring a young person from Just Like Us. Again, a really cool thing that's come out of being able to do digital is I can digitally mentor. I can have Zoom conversations with a queer person I've never met before. But they also have taught these young people, you don't need to answer a question if you don't want to. If you are talking live on a session and someone asks you a question and it makes you uncomfortable, you are not obliged to answer that. So it is just about thinking. And I would say, Dan, that a lot of those systems have been in place for a long time. We have had the internet for many years now, and we are using it much more now, but we have been using it for a long time. So those guidelines are being tested, but they do exist. So if you just do your homework and remember that the internet is an incredibly exciting, powerful space, but there is obviously a dark side. So you just need to be, when you're working with young people, just as you would in the real world, you just need to take those things into account.
I realise it looks like I'm being really rude. I am listening. I've got my phone because Lara's funneling me the questions when they come through, because I've got like loads of screens and stuff like that. So yeah. One of the questions we've had from Harrison Kurt. Do you have any tips for writing and sharing both queer history and the reading of artifacts and artworks? I'm currently in the process of writing some virtual content, and it's quite nerve-wracking to be putting it out online rather than the safe space of the workplace. So any tips for writing and sharing queer history at all? Sacha, do you want to go first, Sacha?
Sure. I mean, it kind of ties in with what we were talking before, right? You put stuff out into this huge, epic public forum, and anyone can give their feedback. It is scary being visibly, openly queer, having queer perspectives. You know, I have a friend who's an academic, and she recently wrote some queer takes on Viking history and received some awful stuff in response. It was a very small minority, but you will get that. So one thing is arm yourself. It's awful that you have to say this, but you have to have a bit of armor. If you go into a public space and you share queer history, 99.9% will be positive and lovely, but you will get the odd person who just wants to wind you up and make your day a little bit worse. So there's kind of going in knowing that. Secondly, there is just that kind of sense of self, which is, this is not a bad thing to do. I think we internalize some homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, where we sort of feel like, oh, I'm talking about the queer sex life of this historical figure. Is that wrong? Is it bad? It's not bad. It's history. It's legitimate. You are doing your job. You are doing the right thing. So you can go in with that. But also having a support network. If you can link out to other queer historians, queer activists, friends who are interested in this content, even if you do get that odd, nasty statement, you are able to go back. I wouldn't recommend doing this alone. Like, make sure you're feeling safe and you're feeling comfortable. In terms of like how you phrase it, it's really challenging. Try to have fun with it. You do not need to treat this history like it is heavy, laden, and difficult and a hot topic. It is a historical fact that is as interesting, as engaging, as important as anything else. So I can totally understand why you might feel hesitancy and you might want to write a guarded, carefully worded, I'm going to think out every possible way someone might critique me or question what I'm saying. And you never will create that watertight argument. You will have to accept that some people won't like it, but they will be a minority, definitely. Dan, what do you think?
One day I will write the omnipotent tweet that gets everything right and will be absolutely perfect, and no one will ever critique, and everybody in the whole world will be happy with. One day we will get there. Just remind yourself also that you know, what we were saying before about the idea of it being about the everyday story, you know, your experience and your lived experience and your expertise is really important as well. Oftentimes we should say more loudly that it is in museums, even in museums, the label, it's still an active interpretation. That's the team that works on it, the interpretation team. So it is them kind of reading history and kind of saying, well, this is what we conclude from our readings of history. And so for you, remember, that's also the case. What you've read and what you know is also really important. And so what you're doing is an active interpretation. So your reading of it is really crucial and vital. And I think it's Sacha sort of has highlighted, get it out there, because yes, people will critique it, have a bit of armor, but also understand that you might also learn from some of the critique as well, and that's okay. But I think more than anything, it's about getting the stories out there, because for queer people in particular, history has been written in a particular way, and it has not been in our favor. It has often oppressed our stories. It has often removed our stories, obliterated it, destroyed it. And so here's an opportunity now for us to actually correct that, and for us to tell the story the way that we'd want it to be told as well. And for me, that's the most important thing about what you're doing, Harrison.
I've just had a question come in from Dan Delmont, who is actually a previous panelist of Hello Culture. And this is a really interesting one, and we could go on for hours about it. And it's an issue that I struggled with years ago. If queer is the politicalisation of LGBT plus identity, what do we think about the co-opting of the term and subsequent overexposure by some companies and organisations? So, for example, if queer is an alternative, how does it fit in a mainstream? Doesn't queer require staying in the margins to maintain its identity? So, yeah, so queer, that phrase and that word, it's one I struggled with years ago. When I first joined, ironically, the board of Shout that time ago, I struggled with that phrase because I didn't like it. I personally didn't identify with it at the time, and I was used to it being hate speech more than anything, as many of us were. So it's quite an interesting thought, that is. Dan, what do you think?
So Jeffrey Weeks is about to release his memoir, and it's called A Queer from the Valleys. So it's going to be a great Welsh history of his life, and in it, or preparing for it, he's just released some really interesting videos about the complex history of the word queer, and the fact that it, from the 16th century, it was used as a term to mean strange, eccentric, etc., through to kind of close to our times. In the late 19th century, we were using it to identify people who were in same-sex relationships. But then, of course, as Dan's mentioned, the politicization of it, the fact that there were people who were within our community having a fight about whether or not it should be gay or queer that prevails in the 50s through to the 70s. Obviously, gay prevailed. Queer was then suppressed, but then it was used as a term of insult, but also reclaimed by people from the 70s, and then strongly, Derek Jarman being a really strong example of someone who said that a word like you, Chris, that he kind of feared, but it became a liberation for him. So there's been this sort of, what it has helped me understand, Jeff has helped me understand, is that kind of the way that the word has changed and moved, and it is a slippery term, and it sometimes comes to the fore, sometimes falls back. For me, I think it is such a strong term for a lot of people who use it as a self-identifier. Jeff now uses it as an identifier. It's on his memoir. And so I think that's, for me, the most important aspect of the word, that across over 100 years of history of people using it as a self-identifier. And that, for me, is the power of it. And I will say that, we've doing some social media stuff for Queer Britain. We get quite a lot of LGBT Alliance people sort of pushing back on the term, saying, oh no, it's an offensive term, as a way of kind of taking the cue. And then, I'm presuming that it will lead to, other letters being sort of removed slowly. I refuse to believe that it because we have over a century of history of it being used by people as self-identifiers, and that's so vital and important that we support them and that we maintain that space for queer people to be able to use that word for themselves. Sacha, you're very experienced with what's going out there on the social media realm as well.
I recently got myself into some seriously hot water talking about the word queer, because it is incredibly, I don't use the word contentious, but it means something different to different groups of queer people. I have a similar kind of relationship to what Chris was saying, which is originally it was an insult, like it was something that people would shout at people. I didn't want to be queer. I didn't want to be odd or strange. And I now love that word, and it falls out my mouth so quickly and so easily. For me, it is the umbrella term that allows me as a cis white gay man to have a shared moment, overlapping but not the same, with anyone else in the LGBTQIA+ community. And for me, it's like that we are all pushing forward, all swimming in the same direction. If we do that, then we can put forward a message that is inclusive and powerful. Now, in terms of it being kind of corporate or becoming mainstream, I have so many different opinions and so many voices in my head. Some of them would definitely agree with Dan and kind of go like, that's not queer, that's selling me a Starbucks, or that's not queer, that's something else entirely. At the same time, I am a public historian. If I'm not telling my story or telling a story to an audience, I'm just stood in the dark. And if I am talking to a group of people who are already 100% already galvanized on my side, know the stuff, know the words, know the talk, right on, that feels great and empowering. And in fact, that's part of activism, is coming together in a community of understanding. But occasionally you also have to go, blue hair, trident, let's talk about mermaids. Oh, you like Disney? Great, come here. Okay, let's talk about gender. And like, that's, sometimes there is a place for opening the door ajar and saying, let's create an accessible space where you may not be part of this community, or you may not be au fait with this. As long as you are respectful, we'll bring you into this queer space and we'll create something that is accessible, that is fun, and may even sometimes be a bit corporate and a bit slick. So I fall both sides. But personally, my big thing is I want to be talking to people. I want to be sharing. And there's a give and take that has to go there with queerness. I love the word queer. I really do. But I completely understand why some people either hate it because they find it insulting, or why some people are starting to get over it because it's stopped having any meaning. But personally, I'm very much into it.
Like I said, I'm the same. Like many years ago, I used to hate the word. And when I sat on that board and they were on about queer festival and queer arts, I was like, can't say that. I mean, I literally now wear it on a t-shirt. I have queer written across my chest. So like my own perceptions. And it's just interesting to see how that's moved over. I mean, I know you two are both geeks as well, and I play lots of Dungeons and Dragons and board games and things, and similar conversations are happening in those worlds as well, you know, and the idea of queer content creators creating board games and Dungeons and Dragons missions and things like that. And from an accessibility point of view, there's you don't even think about it when you're playing these sort of games, but they're now making miniatures and the characters are in wheelchairs, you know, which I think is absolutely fantastic by people being able to identify those different things. And the same is for sort of museum spaces and the content that we create as well. But for many people, it's, you know, it is a journey. And like you said, they land either way on it. We've had so many questions. Go on, sorry, Dan.
Add one little comment, because I think I feel like I do need to directly answer Dan. It's sort of talking about the corporate aspect of it. Yeah, I think based on what Sacha's sort of saying, for me, I'd agree with this in terms of it being about intention. It's about the intention of the organization doing it, because we've got to remember that the organizations are built up of people. And so if there is a strong network within the organization, a staff network that wants to support queer things, that's really strong. If they're seeking to make money off queer people, that's I think where we draw the line. That's not a good intention. So I think for me, having a place like Queer Britain, for example, the intention there is about creating a narrative of queer history of people in Britain. And I think that's, you know, that's where it is still an organization of people seeking to preserve this history and celebrate this history. So I think intention and the purpose is a really important aspect to that consideration.
Brilliant. I'm going to come back with, I realise it's 2 o'clock. We're going to have one final question, so we'll keep this really short. We've had so many questions. Sad we can't get through them, but last one. This is from Jamie Starboyski. If funding was no issue, what queer-focused digital project would you ideally like to bring into the world, and what would its impact on the queer community be? You've got like a minute to answer. So Dan, we'll go with you first. That's all right.
What project would I want to support? I mean, Queer Britain seeks to be the bricks and mortar home of the history of Queer Britain. So it is completing the family tree of our nation by ensuring that queer stories in all their diversity and beauty and all the different ways in which you can tell it are being celebrated.
Brilliant. Sacha?
So for me, it would probably be something that sounds a bit niche, but it would be about queerness in contemporary media. So video games, things like the games that are being created online, music, pop culture, and then tying that back to ancient history. So how can you get from like a character in Super Mario all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia depictions of gender? Because, like I was saying with queerness, that's kind of how I like to reach people. I like to go to where they are, and also I like video games. So that's what came to mind.
I really want to go. I want to just come to London again, and when everything's happened, I really want to do one of your video game tours at the museums, because I saw the bits about the Triforce from Zelda. Sorry, everyone, really geeky. I was like, I had no idea. This is amazing. I need to do these tours. So yeah. Unfortunately, that's literally all we've got time for. It was only an hour today, I'm afraid. But I just want to say a massive thank you to Dan and Sacha, and virtually Kate as well, who would have been here. It's been incredibly enlightening. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Also want to say big thanks to Lara Atnaraja, co-conspirator and program curator, who without this, Hello Culture just would not exist. Sort of her drive to push this event, particularly when we've gone from being used to being physical events to making sure that these conversations still happen. So massive thank you to Lara for this, and long may it continue. Big thank you to Shirley, who has scripted a lot of this content as well. So massive thank you to that, to her. Also thanks to Arts Council England for funding the panel, as well as the BBC Academy, as this event is part of the Digital Cities programme. You can make sure to check out the Digital Cities website for more information about other masterclasses like this that's happening later on in the week, as well as Hello Culture, which will be back hopefully next month as part of the final Digital Cities virtual. And that'll be on Wednesday, the 24th of February. So make sure you keep your eyes peeled for that. As I said, this session has been recorded and we'll be uploading it onto YouTube, so you'll get notifications and things like that. Please follow everyone on Twitter, send your questions in, because there's so much content we haven't been able to answer. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, to our panelists, co-curators, and thanks for you guys for joining us as well. Thanks very much. Hi folks, my name's Chris Brown and I'm co-curator of Hello Culture and founder of Polaroids and Polar Bears. Today we're back with a special edition of Hello Culture. Earlier in the month, you remember that we had a panel on digital and queer culture. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Kate, couldn't make it on the day due to technical difficulties. However, I'm delighted to welcome Kate back to the show, as it were, today, so we can revisit her topics, her experiences, because as part of this content and the context of digital and queer culture, we felt it was really vital that we bring Kate back into the conversation. So Kate, how are you? Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'm all plugged in and charged up, and I'm here, and technology is on our side today, which is great.
Technology has been awful, I have to say. Over the past 12 months, we all thought, oh, technology would be great. You know, it makes us more connected, it's more accessible. I actually think it's meant sometimes people are further apart, because if your internet goes down, that's it, you're stuffed.
It's true. It's a fragile beast.
That's it.
We're operating with.
That's it. So those who aren't familiar with Kate, she's the founder and director of Trans Creative and of Trans Vegas, the annual trans arts festival, which has been going on for over 4 years now. And I'm going to hand over to Kate so she can talk about her experience and things. We've got a lovely little video to show as well, and we'll be doing a little Q&A as well afterwards. So Kate, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So I just wanted to kind of take us back a little bit before I started to talk about my work with Trans Creative. I transitioned 20 years ago into a time of very little trans visibility, zero trans creativity. And the word on the street was that the best way to be trans was to not look trans. The goal was to pass as cisgender. And I remember I was told to burn photos of myself, move cities, and don't look back. But I decided to stay put in Manchester, and I kept my photos, but I did feel very anxious about my trans status being known. I didn't see myself positively represented in TV, film, or theatre, and if trans people were seen, I felt like it was as a freak, a sex worker, or a murder victim, sometimes all three. And those felt like dark times. And I think that might explain why I'm so proud and excited and supportive about where we are now in terms of trans visibility and vibrancy. Because I truly believe that if I had a trans pride to go to, or a fabulous trans arts festival on my doorstep, then maybe I wouldn't have spent so long living in stealth and being frightened to be trans. I think the other thing about being trans, you always kind of felt like you were failing. I felt like I failed as a cis straight woman. I'd already failed at being a man. And I think if there'd been more visibility and vibrancy, I might have embraced the idea that I can never fail at being trans, because I'm perfect at it. In fact, I can only get better at being trans. And the idea that trans people don't have to pass, but that we can excel, would have been really exciting and liberating. I had no idea that being trans would go on to be my full-time job. Yes, you can get paid to be trans. I'm being paid right now to be trans, and no careers advisor is ever going to tell you that. So realising the importance of trans visibility, and more specifically positive trans visibility. About 5 years ago, aged 50, I gave up my kind of real job and joined the circus and returned to performing as an out trans performer. And by creating loud, colourful autobiographical theatre and cabaret shows, I became the opposite of stealth. And here we've got some slides of some of the work that I did. I did pieces about me and Hayley Cropper from Coronation Street. I did a short cabaret piece called A Short History of My Tits. So I was very much using my experience and my body to express myself, really outing myself. And then I went on to make a larger piece called Big Girl's Blouse, which is actually the name my dad called me on a daily basis. Very queer thing to take an insult and turn it into a show. And then my last big show, which is called You've Changed, which saw me telling the story of my 15 years of my life, transitioning from Fred Astaire to Ginger Rogers during the show, ending with the song Let's Face the Music and Dance. So these shows, just by existing at that time, 5 or 6 years ago, felt radical, and they felt like a piece of activism. And to kind of push that forward, I started the hashtag campaign, Stand By Your Trans, which we still have t-shirts available on transcreative.uk, which was lovingly picked up by the Manchester lesbians and led the Manchester Pride Parade a few years ago. And there they are in all their glory. So I was kind of doing okay, and I felt there was a need to create a trans arts organisation in the north of England. Now, no one is ever going to knock on your door and tell you to set up a trans arts organisation in Manchester, just saying. You have to be driven by something. You have to be driven by wanting to change things, driven by the lack of trans representation in the arts, driven by not wanting to get on an expensive train to go down south to see some trans art, driven by the belief in art for social change. Someone once came out on stage to their parents after one of my shows, quite amazing, or driven by the need to celebrate the intersectionality of the trans community, and driven by the belief that build it and they will come. And they did come. Our 2020 online trans festival, I think there's a slide there of our banner poster, that had an audience of 15,000 and is still growing. And here we have a trailer from the event.
Trans Vegas 2020, like a lot of things, went digital this year. And it was created from literally nothing and turned into something special seen by thousands at a time when the trans community was about to take to the streets and demand trans rights due to the Gender Recognition Act's reform.
Today, I urge you to commit that today is the very last day that transphobia will claim the lives, loves, and joys of Black trans people.
It was created at a time when Black trans people most needed to be seen and heard. And it was created at a time when trans people most needed to come together.
The idea that the West is now leading the fight for like queer rights and trans rights is a product of colonialism.
Being part of an effort to pull things back together and to step back into our power and use what platforms we had to share our voices and share some of that anger was really important for me at the time. 'Cause in your world, you are truly free.
Audiences have responded so differently. It's also been a really good opportunity to work with people I wouldn't normally work with.
It was amazing that time that there was such this fascination, and it was almost like trans people, they had a place if you were on stage and they could charge a lot, and there was something very interesting to me about that.
It gave me a sense of community at a very scary, very strange point in time.
I've noticed in the last 3-4 months since this COVID-19, I have done a hell of a lot of growing up. I've done a hell of a lot of changing.
That journey of rapid learning that was necessary and continues to be more necessary.
Here's to 2021. Keep coming together.
That was just a taste of some of the artists who were featured in this year's festival. But over the years, Trans Creative have showcased hundreds of trans artists. We've been funded consistently for over 5 years. We employ trans staff. We've created a platform for trans people to tell their own stories. We've challenged cis-led arts venues to trans up. We've used our trans creativity to help organisations like the NHS to change their thinking around trans issues. We've worked with the Women's Institute, the Samaritans, the government, banks, universities, and that work is ongoing. Last year, going digital, we created 22 digital events for our community, the most heartfelt being our online trans socials every month. Starting off as a really small trans film club where you could eat your dinner on your lap and watch some short trans films, you could laugh and cry with your community. We then decided to move this into a space where you could see exciting new work, offering a place to be part of open mic events, which are now a key part of the socials, nurturing more trans talent. We've had nuanced discussions on Black trans masculinity, colonialism and gender, looked at trans joy through art and euphoria. But the big outcome was that we created a trans exclusive space with no pressure to fill a theatre and no pressure from marketing and press teams. The social clubs proved to be more intimate, supportive and liberating than any other digital event we've held, allowing us a chance to create exciting new work and new audiences. They've inspired ideas for work post-lockdown. We've managed to create events we couldn't create live, like a Black Trans Rally or one of the largest trans masculine art exhibitions in the world, I think, and working with a load of international trans artists. We got into people's homes rather than them having to leave the safety of their home to see some art. This element of trans creative work is here to stay in digital or live form. We are still here telling our own stories.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate. First off, the imagery in some of your shows is just stunning. I absolutely when we first started talking to you and I had those images come through, I was like, oh my god, these pictures are fantastic.
That's deliberate, really. You know, that's very deliberate to make it quite vibrant and positive, and to add that colour and life into the trans narrative, which often, well, I mean, 5 or 6 years ago it wasn't there, and it doesn't necessarily have to be there, but I felt like the opposite was there. There was so much negativity the way we were represented. I felt like I had to counteract that. I don't feel that so much now, but it definitely felt like that a few years ago. And as you can see from the pictures of the other artists, I feel like they've got the same feeling. There's a lot of pride and joy in the pictures.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It is about that pride and moving away from the stereotypes of how certain communities were portrayed in the media, in particular, that trans or gay or black or anybody else looked like this, and this idea of the norm within those communities. And looking at that imagery, it's just like you said, it's just fantastic to see so many vibrant personalities and the creativity coming out of it as well.
And the intersectionality of that as well. I think that's another thing that we're very keen to portray, like around age, race, you know, binaries, disabilities. There's a lot going on in there. I mean, there's April Ashley there and Campbell X and Mel's. There's quite a mix of ages and ethnicities, and yeah, I kind of think that's something we really celebrated, especially this year. We especially felt there needed to be more of a dialogue in between different generations. Yeah, and there's our lovely Trans Social Club, which again are quite vibrant as well. You know, they're deliberately engaging, and I love that that's grown from nothing. That originally was a live. I wouldn't even call it an event. We literally, a few of us gathered. We got some free tickets to theatres in Manchester. Thanks to theatres like Home, gave us some free tickets, and we would meet up and support trans people, just come out and socialise. So we weren't expecting people to come and see our shows all the time. We felt there was a need to step back and nurture the audience and create a dialogue with our audience and maybe get them feeling more interested in the arts, you know, rather than just expecting them to come and see the work we do. I felt like there needed to be some nurturing of our audience. And sadly, we literally had 2 live socials. And then when lockdown happened, I was like, can we put the social club online? And it's just been, they've just been very special. those events. We're celebrating a year actually in March, so we've got one coming up in March, which is going back to our roots of it being a little film club, but it's actually going to be the premiere of a film through the BFI called An Ordinary Man. About a trans masculine story. So it feels nice to come around, and it shows how we've come on. You know, we started off literally with a little collection of films on your own, and now we're kind of working with the BFI to kind of put on one of their premieres of their films.
So we talk about audiences in particular, and how you had two physical events, real life events for the social club, and then I say unfortunately, obviously everyone at the time thought everything going digital. It's unfortunate because we can't really meet in real life. But then you were saying that how that's exploded, that digital space, because digitally and virtually it is a safe space because you can properly monitor who is there. It's accessible as well. It's more accessible sometimes. So did you ever imagine that the social club would just blow up to the size that it has already?
No, I think we've got 300 members now in the social club, and I mean, they obviously don't attend all the events, but in live, and I think it's some logistics of getting people who are sometimes a bit vulnerable to buildings, travelling, through the boroughs of Manchester to get there. That involves quite a lot, but there is still something special about a live. But I think the legacy is we'll probably keep both now. I feel like the digital element is so much part of what we do, and I think we've kind of like the trans masculine art exhibition, we know, or the Black Trans Rally, there are things that we could do quite quickly and much more simply and less expensive online that were just as ambitious, but we could actualize them, whereas we didn't have to kind of block off streets or get a gallery and a lot of white gloves and handle work that's being shipped in from all around the world. I felt like, and also there was this availability of artists and a willingness for artists to come and do Q&As, and maybe if they'd been doing their work in LA or Boston or parts of England, I think we couldn't have got them together. There was a pulling together of the community that I really like to see, and also for me, I'm so live. It was good for me because I could hand over a lot of work. I would maybe think about the ideas and work with the artist.
Mm-hmm.
But I would normally feel like, oh, that's my job to be very present. So I kind of liked that. I didn't have to be there as much. It makes it more sustainable because when you're fronting up a very tiny organisation, it's quite nice to hand it over to our brilliant trans technical support. Like what we're going to do here. With your tech people, it's quite nice to know you're just doing your bit.
Yeah. And as it's going digital and going virtual, and you being able to respond so quickly to things, you're not having to wait round to secure a venue, check availability and dates and all this, so you can go, you know what, that's when we're going to do it, and it's going to happen. So has it changed your creative thinking about what you can and can't do, and I guess you being able to do it constantly as well, not have to wait every 3 months for a space to be available, you can do it more regularly.
That's true, actually. And I think we've actually got very busy. So actually, very typically, like we were getting too busy as an organisation. And in March, there was 3 events that we were planning to put on. And actually one of them we decided to move away from for now. And that meant too, we were quite relieved because although there is an ease to it, there was something about a lot of people a year ago hadn't done much digital stuff. So we were having to buy equipment and send it out to them, and like one of our April Ashley is, I think they're nearly 80, and that was a challenge, and they have some health issues, so we were having to work and we couldn't go into their home, so that was interesting, and so that's kind of that. There was some logistics that took more time, and actually holding the community because there had been a pandemic and lockdown had happened. So the process, we were spending our time doing different things rather than worrying about venues. We were very much focused on our artists, like especially we work with a lot of Black artists, so we were really having to hold our Black artists while Black Lives Matter came in during the just before our festival happened in June. The George Floyd killing, and so that's where we had to hold it. But I think that just sharpened us all up as well. It was another bit of learning, and we took, like, we had a Black Trans Lives Matter rally where we did it as a fundraiser, and we consulted with some Black artists, but actually we went away and made that rally, that digital rally, with their directions. Like, they wanted something gentle and peaceful and kind and beautiful. So we made the rally with their direction, but we were like, you sit down and just recover from what has happened for 5 minutes, and we'll go and do that. But I do think you're right. We still, even with all that, because we've got a brilliant tech team, we could respond. Like, when another lockdown came in, we quickly got a social out. Yeah, and I love that. And I think we're still doing that a bit. It doesn't feel like you have to plan it years in advance. And I think I'm not looking forward to that, if I'm honest. You know.
Is there, I mean, many communities have become more visible during the pandemic due to technology, due to Zoom and events and rallies and things like that. So when we go back to the real life, you know, not that this isn't real, but when we go back to the physical world of things, do you think, or how do you think venues and cultural organisations will respond? Because your events in particular have provided a fantastic platform to a great number of trans artists and individuals. And Lara and myself, when we've curated Hello Culture conferences, and we've been approached at the end, oh, how have you found so many fantastic speakers? How have you found so many women speakers, or Black speakers, or trans speakers? And you're like, they are out there. You they're not invisible. You have to find them. So do you think the venues will start thinking about how they program differently, or do you think it will just go back to how it was?
I think you're right. I think some people have risen to the top. You know, people who maybe don't normally get an opportunity to get into those venues and find those stages have definitely joined in our open mics and started to develop work. So I think you're right. I think there is a whole load of artists who have hopefully cut their teeth a little bit digitally and really got stuck into Instagram and TikTok, and you know, and I really love that. I think as well, the other side in terms of venues, we're really keen for venues to support trans only events, which means, you know, not as many bums on seats. And I think that's going to be interesting. How do we take the learning that we've done, that we've always known that's a really beautiful environment, but if we really commit to that trans only environment, what is that going to be like for venues? I hope it's a new world, and I think sadly some venues aren't even existing. So I think we all have to think about, where can we provide spaces for people who are artists or want to be artists or have something to say, have a voice? How can we provide that? And I would say now we are definitely thinking hybrid all the time. Now, you know, like, because you're applying for funding 3 months ahead. So we're putting words like, we find hybrid is the best way for us to do it. But none of those events feel shoddy now. Like, we're thinking about public art. Like, public art can exist without really causing much stuff around COVID. And maybe that's pushed us more into visual arts. And the exhibition, the trans exhibition we did, that really made us think about visual arts. And there's a bit of it we haven't really explored that. So it's about, is it a good time to look at film now? You know, because it feels safer and people are used to that. So we're trying to think of events that could still happen online. But when you get 15,000 people coming to your event, it's kind of, you can't help but ignore that, compared to, we'd be lucky, like our numbers have tripled over the last year or so, but we were lucky to get like 200 was great to get to an event. That was really amazing. And also I do quite like the fact that our whole festival has lived online for 6 months, and we paid extra to have the art exhibition online for a year. So I feel like it's, when we go back in, it's had quite a lot of views still, and it feels like a bit of archive. So I think we never would have done that. I think we kind of upped our game digitally.
And how do you think, because obviously your audiences have grown tremendously over the past 12 months and prior to that as well, in terms of, and digital has allowed you to engage with more people, reach more people. When growing up, when you know, I was exploring my own sexuality and things like that, didn't know any gay people at all, did not know what they were, that we existed as a community because there wasn't anyone at school. I didn't know anybody, and there was no representation on TV that I knew of at that time. So how do we support I guess younger people, but also older people that may not have access to, they may not know trans creative exists? So what's the onus on everybody else to try and educate and support and let people realize that what you are as an individual does exist, and there are other people like you?
Yeah, and I think that's quite vital, like you say. I think if you can't see yourself, you can't be yourself. I really kind of believe that, and I think that's where culture really plays a big part in that we can, if we provide enough freedom and space, you can get to meet people. And I think the responsibility of that is really interesting. Like, whose responsibility is that? I feel like this tiny trans arts organisation has got enough to do, and I'm always encouraging our allies to champion us, know the value. Like Manchester, I'm always really trying to make sure that Manchester Council know us, Manchester Pride know us, all the boroughs of Manchester are interested, so they can pick it up, know about us, and place us and centre the work we do. I'm really interested in elevating, because we've been going 5-6 years now, and we've got quite a good reputation. You know, we're quite professional and we're quite innovative, and I think we're getting that reputation. And like organisations, a few organisations have approached us to do stuff online now, like collaborate with them, and we have done a few collaborations. So I feel like people are getting a bit of confidence in who we are, and I think some of that has come down from being digital and being out there and being seen. So yeah, I think it's not our job in the same way it's not black people's jobs to sort out racism.
Yeah.
No, it's everybody's job. And I think the arts has got a long way to go. I mean, my favourite question to ask any arts venue that is supported and funded is, what trans work are you programming? And that's a very interesting question. And then I quickly follow it with we've got loads of work. If you're stuck for work, we've got loads, and we know loads of artists. And it's a really, the person who works on our funding taught me that. You just stop talking for a minute and go, not put them on the spot. And it's not to make them feel, it's not to challenge them, it's to highlight that, because unfortunately my job as the artistic director is to ask that question regularly, because I'm always disappointed that an arts venue can't just program a season of trans work. They're really happy to program a season of cis work all year round, all year round. So why can't they just not have us, you can have a Wednesday afternoon, you can have a Sunday, you can, when are they going to centre us? And I feel like sometimes it's like, I always think the editor of Vogue, you know, when they got a black editor of Vogue, shit changed. And I feel like that's some of the power structure of organisations are very cis and very straight. So I think unless we get some change, we're always going to be battling. I feel like you either move off the seat of power and let us in, or you literally hand it over for a season at least. And I think that would, for me, I like the idea you just jump over things, you know, rather than going, we'll slowly introduce trans work gently. It's like, why don't you just blow that door open and like you've done it all your life? And I've seen that with some, you can see Netflix is looking a lot more black since Black Lives Matter, and the work is very good. Do you know what I mean? And really, I'm loving it. It's not perfect, but you can just feel that. And I'm like, I feel like trans people are like, we've got ahead of us are gay people. I feel like, you know, gay men especially, they're ahead of us. We've got black people a bit ahead of us. And I'm watching what the trajectory is for that. I'm learning and listening and sitting and watching black politics and how black people are treated, if you like, or what opportunities they have in the arts. Because I feel like we're behind that. And if you're black and trans, you know, it's like the intersectionality can just go on. And then disabled and trans, you know, we're all chelping on about the same thing. You know, we're all a bit tired of the white, straight, cisgendered man being in charge. And I think we like to be part of that. We're ready. We're ready. You know, should it happen, we're ready digitally. We're ready live. We've got a literary festival coming up. You know, we're trying to like cover all bases. You know, public art. we're keeping, and also the nice thing is because we've had a bit more time, I've started to get support from other queer arts organisations, you know, because I think we need to come together. I feel there's a real need to come together, and I'm feeling that a little bit more. I'm feeling quite supported by the queer arts community, you know, which is nice.
That's good. I think the gauntlet has well and truly been thrown down. And any cultural organisations that are watching this, please contact Kate. She knows everybody and will program you a season. I think that's what needs to happen. But quickly, you talked about the season in terms of programming. So people do it with a bang. Look, this is here.
Yeah.
Would the playing devil's advocate, would you prefer a big season like that, or not drip feeding it at all, not suggesting that, but you know what, well, it just becomes part, do you know what I mean? It's a thought. It's hard to explain it.
I'd like it to land. Same with I just feel like it's quite a political thing to do.
Yeah.
Because it's like suddenly, and you can almost like I like to see more Black work out there on all mediums. It's like I'm sure if I was Black, I'd still think there was no work out there. So this is very much from a white point of view, but my white privilege, you know, and is definitely, even from that standpoint, it feels that, and I kind of feel like that's on my radar. If you're Black, it probably still feels, maybe it still feels token. I'm not sure, but I would really celebrate any more. If it was inching forward, I would be gracious and go with that. I'm saying that more like I suppose it's more of a question. Why can't that happen when there's so much this way? It's more of a provocation, I think, than a dream and a fantasy that I'm holding my breath for. But it's like when, you know, like suddenly an artistic director of a theatre is queer, a really big, you know, like in Manchester, the Royal Exchange, suddenly the joint artistic directors were Black and a lesbian. That suddenly felt a little bit more contemporary and reflective and representative. And I stood up, and you feel like that organisation had shaken off some of the dust. And I feel like that when you see trans work done well and centred properly, you just feel like some of the dust has been blown off. We've actually finally shaken off some of the dust, really. You know, we're finally acknowledging that things are right. It's going to be great when it happens.
Yeah.
I don't know what we need to do, but I'm so up for it. I can retire happily, you know.
It is that, how do you get there? Because it's like doing what you as an organisation do, like allies do, and things like that. Like you said, it's got to be that change from the top, because you know when the head of cultural programming has changed at an organisation, because you can see that shift, and quite often it is so dramatic, and you're like, why has it taken this? Literally, sometimes it feels like you've removed the problem, which could be you've got them somewhere else and put somebody else in instead.
And how gracious are I always look to how gracious Black people are around when that happens. They're so great, and I really have to learn that, you know, because I'm a bit like, I can be a bit, you know, about time there, and I look to Black people, and they're just so like at lab. There's a history that is just, there's something about that I just really aspire to. When it does happen, I don't want to look like told you so about bloody time. You know, it really has to be like, okay, let's enjoy this and move forward with this. Let's see, you know, and slightly fearful how long will it last, you know, and I'm sure that, you know, the community, but yeah, get people in power. I don't know any trans artistic directors of any major arts organisations, apart from mine, you know. So, and I don't know any of the trans arts festivals in the UK. So,
well, Kate, we've run out of time now, but thank you so much for joining me today.
I got all fired up on a.
I think we were gutted when you couldn't join us for the issue of it, but I think today's conversation is incredibly important, not only for the fantastic work that you're doing with Trans Creative in terms of the programming, but also just hearing your thoughts on in terms of changing the industry and what changes need to be made as well going forward. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so glad we could do it.
Yeah, and that's it. That's all we've got time for today, folks. So thank you very much. We'll be back in February with our next edition of Hello Culture, and we're joined with the keynote of Cold War Steve. the artist, but then also we have a panel on protests as well, which I'm very much looking forward to as well. So keep an eye on the Hello Culture website, and hopefully we'll see you at our next event. Thanks very much.